Hell, you could say that 10,000 times and it still wouldn't be enough.
It fires me up, man.
I love it. Say it one more time.
Shake it back!
Does that feel good?
Yeah, it rhymes. They're both verbs.
And welcome back, folks, to the latest, greatest episode of the Shaving Points podcast. My name is Quentin Crisco. You can find me on Twitter at BuckhissStats. And unfortunately, Jay cannot be here with us for the first part of this show, so you're stuck with me and our guest, Laurie Lattimore-Volkman. Laurie, can you tell the people a little bit about yourself and where they can find your work?
I will. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. I am with SB Nation's Mile High Report, and you can find my work at milehighReport.com, and you can find me on Twitter at DocLLV. That's the two places where I'm most active. I have been a Broncos fan since I was born 1,000 years ago, and I've been through the ups and downs. It was a lot of down, then it was up for many years, and then it's kind of been down the last couple. So looking for a little bit of a resurgence so that my life on Twitter can be much happier.
And I'll tell you, I've been staring at this Broncos roster and coaching staff for the last week and just going it's got to work, right? I mean, so let's just jump right in. What do you think the state of this team is? The roster, the franchise, the everything?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm glad you separated them because I think it's actually they could be very different answers. So let's start with the franchise. I think the franchise is in good shape. We finally got real owners. We'd been kind of in a state of flux where we'd had a trust who was operating the ownership after Pat Bowlen died, but before they found an owner. And that there were a lot of problems with that for a variety of reasons that don't matter. But
no one to make the hard decisions, right?
Yeah, and right. And there wasn't enough accountability, and it allowed the franchise, I think, to kind of drift backwards without any real urgency to change it or to fix it. And I don't think it was anybody's and here for one example though, which could have changed completely the direction of the Broncos right now. But John Elway, back in whichever year that he ended up, I think, hiring Vance Joseph. So it was kind of it was after Gary Kubiak retired.
Yeah, still on the Super Bowl high, right?
Yeah. And Kubiak did one more year, but then he decided that was enough. And, we went 8-8 that year. So it wasn't it was the kind of year where it wasn't terrible. We didn't win anything, but we had just won the Super Bowl. So you give yourself, and we lost Payton Manning. So you kind of feel like that's okay.
Right.
We can handle one
There's
of those.
There's some leeway there.
Yeah. But then Elway wanted to hire Kyle Shanahan, and the head of the trust, cannot believe his name. I'm blanking on his name because he was so irritating, but he did not he had a big beef with Mike Shanahan years before. And
I think I vaguely remember this.
So he would not let Elway hire Kyle. And just, I don't know, I think if you think about what would have happened to the Broncos if Kyle Shanahan had come in.
Whole different ball game.
Yeah, and I think Vance Joseph did some things really well. I mean, he was good at defense, and he was a first-time head coach, and he had a lot of growing pains, but he also had a bad quarterback situation. And I think we know if there's anyone to fix or to change a quarterback situation, it's Kyle Shanahan. So I think we would have been in a very different spot with our quarterback problems, which we have continued to have the last 7 years or 6 years. So I think that kind of thing showed where the ownership really did hamper and hamstring the franchise, or the lack of a true owner. And it was in and out of the courts, and it was a huge headache and distraction, mostly for the administration, but it impacts everyone. It impacts the whole building, I think. So anyway, we got that settled. We have the Walton Group that's got a ton of money, and so far, too, Greg Penner, who's the son-in-law, or maybe even grandson-in-law of Sam Walton. He has gotten really into the football side of it, not making decisions, but like being very interested in the football and recognizing the importance to fans. And it's been really refreshing because Pat Bowlen was such an anomaly, for an owner. Like he loved football. He loved the game. He was hands off, but he spent a lot of money on the facilities and gave Shanahan whatever he wanted, within what we could afford, but that was quite a bit. And he just did so much for the game, and we were very spoiled, to be honest. And then when you get new owners, you never know. Like, are they just going to be in this for the money? Are they going to are they going to care about the football? And Greg Penner, they're putting money into the same things Pat Bowlen put money into: fixing the facilities, upgrading the staff, upgrading the training facilities, and the
health
just,
and nutrition and like the
yeah,
weight
like,
rooms and
yes,
everything.
right, and things that really matter to players a lot, and ultimately trickle down to affecting the performance of your team at some point. So the fact that he's really into improving football, but letting the coaches and everybody make all those choices, and not trying to make the decisions when in a place he doesn't know anything. I look at that as such a positive and a good future for the franchise down the road. And bringing in Sean Payton definitely shows that. And Sean Payton and Greg Penner get along really well. So we've got already a good head coach, GM and owner, good relationship there. So I think all those things are so healthy, and we probably overlooked them before, but after the past 6 years, it's been pretty obvious that you really need a good situation in all three of those spots to then be able to build your team the way you want to long term. Now,
Yeah.
about the roster, I would say, who knows? Just like you said, it should work, but it hasn't worked yet, and so there's a lot of question marks. And Russell Wilson's the biggest one, and whether Sean Payton is the kind of the magic wand there to get him back to where he was, or at least back to being good enough to lead a team really into some big wins into the playoffs. I think that's a little bit unknown. We're certainly crossing our fingers and hoping and assuming that it's going to be the case, but we don't know. And our best running back is coming back from a big knee injury. Our wide receiver room, we had injuries, and Jerry Jeudy was off and on. And like, we have players that should be amazing, but we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
And defense has been great and has remained really good. I think the question mark there might be leadership. Vance Joseph is known for being a good defensive coordinator, but we had a really good defensive coordinator last year, and we lost a few players. I think we replaced them with pretty much about the same level, but our secondary is a little thin, and so there's still some question marks of whether we can be as dominant as we've been. So I can't tell you how we're going to be as a team yet, but I think if this year doesn't work out, I think we have the ownership in place and we have the coach in place that'll ultimately build us to get us back to where we need to be within 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. So there's two things you mentioned that really, the first really resonated with me, and the other is just something that I feel like I gotta say, because I spent way too many hours looking up a ton of data on it. And so the first thing about ownership that just loves football, and that really resonates with me as a Bears fan. And I feel like I need to say this about it. Like, one thing I always question about the Bears ownership is, like, I'm not sure they love football more than they love owning a football team.
Yeah.
It's like they're not invested in the sport, in the game. They're invested in the team that their great grandfather and grandfather started.
Right.
So it feels like different things. And I think you're right. I think that's the type of thing that does go down in the top down in an organization, that passion. Now the second thing is about Sean Payton. I mean, you don't find coaches like this much. You just don't. I mean,
Right.
so you don't find Super Bowl winning head coaches very often, period. History says when you do, it's usually a struggle, but a lot of those guys were over the hill almost. You're like
Right.
Marty Schottenheimer's in 2001, who's pushing 70, and you're like Joe Gibbs coming back to Washington in 2004 after like a decade off and stuff like that, and Dick Vermeil with KC. Like, it was just times were kind of past some of these guys, but with Sean Payton, he was so young when he came in, and I mean, nine playoff appearances. Essentially, the most comparable guy I'm seeing is Andy Reid, as far as like a guy who's had this type of success year in, year out offensively, who just stuff kind of soured where he was at with another team and he left it. And he's just taking his second shot now, which I think there's a lot to like here. I mean, you look at his numbers, and that's a lot of green. That is a lot of green. I mean, you see the rushing offense is almost always top 10 even. And I mean, he's considered a passing guy, but like there's the only year that was really down was 2021 when they had all sorts of injuries. I mean, I believe before Breeze went down in 21, they were still top 15 in most of these stats. And it's like there's a lot to really like with what Sean Payton's bringing to the table. Now, my second question is, what's the thing you're most excited for with the Broncos this year? It might be different from last year. It might just be, a slight adjustment.
Well, it's going to sound like maybe like we planned this or like I'm just copycatting, but I am most excited about Sean Payton.
Hey, I clearly can't blame you.
I mean, to add to that, what I'm excited about is to see someone finally give us an offense that will be fun to watch. Whatever that means. Like, I don't care if it's a running game. I don't care if it's the offensive line just pushing us all the way to the goal line. Like,
that's fun.
Yeah. The goal line is fun. Scoring is fun. We haven't done that. Last year, I just read this stat, which I knew but hadn't really remembered how really embarrassing it was. But so, the first 15 games, Nathaniel Hackett was the coach, and then he got fired with 2 weeks left, and we had he wasn't even our assistant. He was the guy. It was Jerry Rosberg was a guy that Nathaniel Hackett actually brought in to help him manage the clock, essentially manage the game in week 5, because he had done so poorly. And, credit to Nathaniel he was always good about trying to do whatever it would be to improve him and improve the team. It just didn't work. But anyway, those first 15 games, our average offense, like the number of points we scored was 15.1 or something. The last 2 weeks with the new guy who made a couple of changes, our average scoring was 27 points. And that was like against KC on one of them and the Raiders, I think. So when you look at how poor our offense was, even with all these wide receivers that are supposed to be hot stuff, and with Russell Wilson, like we couldn't score more than 2 touchdowns most games. So I'm excited for whatever Sean Payton's going to do, because I know it will be an offense. It'll be fun games to watch.
Yeah, I think when I was diving into Russ's stats, one of the things I noticed was the last 2 weeks of the year were one of the highest play action rates of the year for the offense. And I mean, I can't sit here and say that play action is a, solve all for everything, because if the run game isn't going, it still helps some, but it's not the effect that you need. And that was the reason why I pointed out Sean Payton's rush offense stats. Right. I think Sean Payton's walking into here saying, I know I need a strong ground game. If I'm going to get Russ back to where he needs to be, to maxing out the shotgun and maxing out what we can do away from the middle of the field, because that's where Russ has always thrived at, is on the boundaries.
Right.
And
100%.
Yeah. I mean, Go ahead.
That's the funny thing is it wasn't even a magic formula. We knew all season. We would talk about it at SB Nation, like, where's the play action? And Hackett would talk about it, then they'd like throw it in, but then they'd take it away. It was just very inconsistent, and you can't do that with the play action. Like the whole point of it is
It
that
was
you do it so that
extremely
then you can do what
volatile.
you need to do. It was terrible.
One moment that like 1 week they're up near the top of the league in play action rate. The next week they literally use like one play. It was like it was very bizarre when I was looking at the numbers, and it felt it almost. And I say this without having any knowledge of what was going on in that building or like what players to coaches, but it felt like a power struggle between two people. One saying we need play action, the other saying, okay, we used it last week. Now it's my turn.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. It felt like they were always just throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what would stick, and it's like you're the head coach or you're like, and you're supposed to come in with the scheme and have a plan. And I don't know that Russell Wilson was making a power play against Nathaniel Hackett, but I think Nathaniel Hackett was too quick to like try to say, we're going to do what's good for Russell, but he didn't really know how to do that. And then Russell didn't know how to say, let's just do this. Like they were both too new at running the show because, Russell always just did whatever Pete Carroll told him to do. I mean, Pete Carroll's a very domineering coach. And I think Russell Wilson didn't like that so much. And that's part of why he wanted out at Seattle. But he also didn't know how to just go in and do it. Like I think he wants to be a pocket passer and he's not. Or I think he wanted to try that. But anyway, what you're saying, I think, is exactly what happened. I don't know why it was happening because it was funny because it wasn't like you had typical two really strong personalities going up against each other. It's almost like you had two people who really wanted to make it work, but couldn't let the other one just take charge, or didn't know how to work that way. And so we were constantly, no one could figure out what our identity was on offense. And there's no way that problem will happen under Sean Payton. No way.
Everyone knows whose voice is loudest in the room in Sean Payton.
And I think that's also why it's going to be good for Russell Wilson because, whatever point last year, I'm sure realized it wasn't working for him and he couldn't maybe do what he thought he was going to do. And so it humbled him quite a bit to the point where I think he will listen to whatever Sean Payton wants to tell him. Because at the end of the day, Russell Wilson wants to win also, and he'll pretty much do whatever that takes. So, and I think he trusts Sean Payton because, as you mentioned, I mean, he's got such a resume. Who's going to come in and say, yeah, you've won a Super Bowl, you've gone to the playoffs, but I don't think you know what you're doing. That's not going to happen.
I mean, I think there's something to be said for a guy. I mean, the New York Jets have some of it right now. You see what Aaron Rodgers is saying about what he wants their offense to be. And there's this nostalgia to be the Peyton Manning sitting in the pocket, tearing you up over the middle of the field into the danger zone because you're just that good. That's what every quarterback, I think, wants to be at their heart. And it's like a big part of it is NFL defense started taking that away a few years ago. Like that's just not really there anymore unless you're otherworldly good, unless you're like a Pat Mahomes, which might be a dirty word to Broncos fans.
It is. Well, I think, and I even would argue, I mean, Pat Mahomes is amazing, but he's amazing athletically, and I think he's very good. But Peyton Manning, and I even don't really want to admit this, but even like Tom Brady. And probably Drew Brees, like those guys, they had a different skill set that you don't see in these other quarterbacks, which was that anticipating what the defense was going to do because they'd done so much film study and they knew what the thing was that was likely to be done, and they could look at the formation and break it down in a millisecond. Peyton Manning's ability to break down the defense so quickly and still get the ball off quickly is kind of otherworldly. Like and he would not get away with that as much now because of the defenses, but he just needs another good, they just still needed maybe one more half second from the offensive line and they'd have it. They
Yeah.
just have a mind for that I don't think most of our quarterbacks
Yeah.
have anymore because they don't learn it. They don't maybe need to have it. Well, maybe that's not right, but they haven't had to survive on it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, the quarterbacks have been getting the position itself has been getting more and more athletic every year.
right.
It's become more of, you know,
You guys know that for sure
add
with
ability.
your quarterback.
Oh yeah, we're very excited about that. But one other thing I pulled up for Russ here was I was trying so hard to find veteran quarterbacks who changed teams. Like I initially tried to find former Pro Bowlers who changed teams, but there's only like 4 of them, so it's not even worth looking for. But so I ended up settling for veteran quarterbacks, had been established starters in the league who switched teams, underwhelmed their first year, and how they did in their second year. And so I end up with Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, Carson Palmer with Arizona. I didn't count his Raiders stint in there.
Yeah, right.
And then your guy's old pal Jay Cutler. Both of our pals, Jay Cutler.
He's your pal too.
And then Matt Castle and Trent Green. And every one of these guys mentioned. So I mean, it's not the most impressive list. Don't get me wrong there, but every one of these guys mentioned were in the bottom 12 of the NFL in EPA per play their first year on the new team. And all except for one was in top 10 for EPA the second year.
Oh, I like that stat. Nice to know.
Yeah. The one was Jay Cutler, if that makes you feel warm and fuzzy.
It does, kind of. That was
then let's see, 4 of the 6 made the playoffs the next year as well. And 4 of those 6 had a change of offense.
Oh, so, wow. Well, that's interesting.
I think there's something to be said for a guy having to look himself in the mirror after a year with a new team and say, like, I got to figure something out because I can't do this again.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Aaron Rodgers, and I will be really interested to see what happens there because, of course, Hackett is going to be his offensive coordinator.
Yeah.
And so, Broncos fans are going to be very interested just to see what happens to Hackett. But, I don't think Hackett will be running the show. I mean, I think it'll be just the same as it was at the Packers where Aaron Rodgers will essentially be the OC. And, the head coach of the Jets is a great head coach. And so I imagine they'll work together more than Hackett and Saleh will.
Yeah, I imagine Saleh will. It's hard to say until like you see it.
Yeah.
Though. I guess it's like, I mean, being a Bears fan, I've seen some really good defense. Lovie Smith was a really good coach for us, but he could never figure out anything on the offensive side. So I just can't give someone that credit until I've seen it.
Yeah.
But with Hackett, I do worry a little bit if Rodgers' arm is at all tailing off, and like I mentioned, the ideal that these guys want to live up to, being that pocket passing slinger who can just tear you up over the middle.
Yeah.
If he can't nail those throws down, Hackett's the same guy who I think just like kind of get out of hand last year with a guy trying to be that.
Yeah. I think what became very clear to me too, like there were all kinds of issues as we already talked about, but I just came away every week thinking he just really isn't as good at offense as we thought. Like, and we didn't understand that. I mean, we knew he wasn't calling the plays at the Packers. We knew that LaFleur was doing it, but we being ownership who hired him and whatever, just kind of let that slide like that. Well, that's okay. He had Aaron Rodgers and they had this offense and he'll know what he's doing. And I just think it became very clear he really doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
He knows some football and he's been around football and I'm sure he knows some good offenses, but it's different to know offense and from also being able to apply that to the players you have. And he was just no good at doing that for us.
Yeah. It's a very different game once like at that aspect beyond just knowing. Now, one more question here for you. What's a change you're worried about or nervous about with the Broncos for this year?
I should qualify that as I'm always nervous about everything with the Broncos because I've been a fan for so long and I watch every game and I never am confident we're going to win a game, even when we're the favored one. But just looking at the team as it is, I think probably what I am the most worried about is um, is the defense falling off a little bit. Um, I like Vance Joseph. I thought he just had a bad situation when he was our head coach, and so I think he's a good defensive coordinator. He loves his defensive backs, and we have a couple very good. We have a great safety in Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson. He's getting a little older, but I think he's very, very good still. But then at the cornerback, we have Pat Surtain, who's amazing. But then after that, we've got like kind of this handful of relatively untested players. Damari Mathis is probably going to be opposite him, and he's just a second-year player. And he had a little bit of a rough start last year, but kind of, he got a lot better. But I still feel like,
for what it's worth, his stats came out really well by the end of the year.
Yeah,
they were like, definitely you could see that it was a roller coaster.
Yeah,
but like his overall stats did show something to be excited about.
He did have some, and he did have some big plays near the end too. But then once you go beyond our starters, I feel like the depth is very thin. And when you're playing in the AFC West and you're playing the offenses that we're playing and you're playing the receivers we're playing, I probably am the most worried about our secondary, being able to hold up all season to the offenses we're going to play.
I think that makes sense. And I think so for every one of these, I go through pretty much the whole roster, and I'm just digging in, and depth is really the biggest thing that I'm looking for.
Edge rushing too. That's also another spot.
And so I don't know if this is comforting or not. Very few teams have any real depth at cornerback so far that I've looked at, and this is the fourth AFC division we've done. Like there were one or two that you felt good about the depth, but the rest is kind of like, man, I really can't tell you that much about Isang Bassi or Tremont Smith. I just don't know.
Isang Bassi's had a tough, he's come in and had some, we put these guys in their third, fourth string, and they're going up against, some top, not just the wide receiver 1 or 2 from a team, but a team that's got, some really top receivers. So he's, they've been highly tested, but he wouldn't make the roster on any other team either. He's definitely third string, fourth string, whatever he is.
I do think Riley Moss has a chance to give you guys some quality depth there, though.
And so our rookies seem impressive, but you never know because they're rookies. So you hope they get in, hope they play, and that you hope that they are what you were hoping. That's another thing, though, with Sean Payton being part of this draft. And before the draft, I had been talking on a radio show, and I said, one of the things I'm going to be interested at the draft is less about the players and more about the power play between him and George Payton, the GM. George Payton loves to trade back and get a lot of picks, and he just likes to have a lot of picks, and he likes to
that's not the New Orleans strategy.
No, and no, it's not. And Sean Payton loves to get the better guy, and if he has a lot of picks, he'll trade them to go up, and and get trade 2 picks to get 1 higher pick, and that's exactly what happened. We ended up with only 5 draft picks. And last year I think we had 10, before you get the undrafted players. So I thought to I like to see that Sean Payton's philosophy won out, because that means he was getting players he believes in, and he's had a pretty good record in terms of picking players and finding talent. So I'm hopeful that guys like Riley Moss and who's the other guy, Sanders, that these guys are going to be they're probably going to be playing, hopefully, maybe not right away, they'll be in there soon.
So I did a lot of draft coverage this year, and I gotta say, you guys, I thought you guys got some of the most bang for your buck in the entire draft. As far as the players and where you got them. Like Marvin Mims is a guy I was high on. Drew Sanders, I thought, was a borderline first round talent. He's a linebacker, so you weren't sure he was going to go that high, especially being a tweener linebacker. I'm interested to see what Vance Joseph can do with him.
Yeah, because and he's probably perfect in a Vance Joseph defense. Joseph likes to use his linebackers a lot and use them even for DBs kind of. So, yeah.
And then so I got to ask about the other guy who was one of my I'm an offensive lineman at heart. I love scouting offensive line. I love watching it. Alex Forsyth was unreasonably one of my favorite players in this draft. The center, I picked at 257. I'm curious to see if he's going to push Cushenberry at all.
I think a lot of people are expecting him to. Remind me though, did he drop because of injury?
Probably. Usually when I like a guy this much and he falls this far, it means there's non-public injury information that's like really pushing him down. And so that would be what I imagine it was. But I don't remember any major injuries that were, clearly available.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I remember I followed Dane Brugler a lot, and he had Forsyth as I don't know, top 5 in his among the centers, in the draft, which seems like, so I think he had him in a high, 5th round, essentially grade, and we got him in the 7th. So again, great value and potentially, I think, definitely a guy to push Cushenberry. Well, it'll be good because Cushenberry, it's been a little tough for him too. Because our offensive line has been terrible, and I think sometimes he's looked worse than he actually is. It's partly just the position he's in, trying to do too many things, make up for too many, mistakes and weaknesses. But when he came out, I remember, they talked about him being a smart guy, so he understands the offense well. He picks up the offensive scheme well. So hopefully it just makes him better. But I think I think the time is coming at some point soon.
Yeah. I'm pretty intrigued by this offensive line group as a whole. Cushenberry's a guy who I'm probably not as high on anymore, but he could definitely prove me wrong there as well. It's not like I sit here watching his all 22 all the time either. So I can't say I'm an expert. But I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the numbers flush out pretty well for Cameron Fleming, who's now a swing tackle, which probably makes this one of the deeper tackle groups in the NFL, I think. Just having 3 guys who you feel like you can start on any given Sunday.
Yeah, which is interesting because, we've offensive line has been our Achilles heel for years. Even with Peyton Manning, but Manning just was able to cover it up so well that you didn't quite notice how bad it was.
And then on the interior, Quinn Miners is, if you're an offensive lineman guy, you have to love Quinn Miners. And Ben Powers, he really played well last year as a pass protector, at least. His run blocking left a little to be desired, but I feel like this is a well-rounded group that should be able to do some damage for Sean Payton.
Yeah. Well, this was another place where Sean Payton's philosophy went out big. When free agency, we spent a lot of money and we mostly went on offense and offensive line. So, and he talked about before he even came to the Broncos, but when it was, they were kind of tying him to the Broncos and the Broncos were interested and all that. And he would talk about how Russ Wilson's biggest problem was the offensive line, or at least Russ Wilson's performance problems were due in part to a bad offensive line. And he said early on, the way you fix that is through free agency. and you do the other a little bit in the draft maybe, but he went hard for that offensive line in free agency and we spent the money and it should be much improved.
Yeah. Now on Garrett Bowles, I didn't catch what his injury was last year, but is he back in camp in full go, or is it still kind of tender?
No, I think he is back in camp. I don't know if he's, they haven't done a whole lot.
Right. Or I guess not even camp, OTAs.
I don't think there's any concern that he won't be fully ready by training camp.
Okay. And then you mentioned a little earlier with Javonte Williams. How's his injury progressed throughout the offseason? I feel like I've seen some really optimistic takes and I'm not sure where to actually trust it.
Yeah, well, it's been funny because there've been optimistic takes, and then it will seem like he's dipped backwards because you'll hear something that said he's not going to be ready, is going to be ready, it's going well, he's a little bit behind. Like it's been very, it's been kind of up and down the way the reporting's gone. He's been practicing though, and like they've talked about in OTAs and then even in the mini camp, he's been running around. So,
Okay.
and Sean Payton has said now officially, he has said, I shouldn't say he said officially, but he has actually answered the question in the press conferences that he does not expect Javonte to start on the PUP list. So
Okay.
he should be ready to go. Now, how strong he is and how much of a starter and back to full form by training camp and week one, who knows yet? They're not doing anything that matters yet. So.
Yeah, right. And then I got one more question, or really two, but it's about one position on the offense here with the receiver room. So, I mean, I feel like we have a pretty good idea what Courtland Sutton is after he came back last year from the injury. And Jerry Jeudy started to really show some of what he could be last year. But where's Tim Patrick within this roster?
Yeah, Tim Patrick is interesting. I think he's the kind of receiver Sean Payton will really like. So I think he'll actually, he's always been like on the bubble for the wide receiver group, like in training camp and making the roster. And it always would depend on if we're going to do 5 receivers or 6. And most people would put him back at 5, 6, 7. And I think last year he made the roster and was listed as 5, but then he'd be the guy. He was always the most consistent. He'd be back on the roster, but because other guys would get hurt, he'd be playing and he'd come up with big plays. He always drops the ball. I mean, I think he's a great receiver. He's a big guy. So big bodied and unafraid, so assuming his knee is in good shape and he's back on track, I think Sean Payton will use him a lot.
Yeah, I mean, is Sean Payton likes underdogs at receiver? You think back to Marcus Colston, and he's had a few other UDFA types like in his time in New Orleans that really kind of came up big for him. And then the other question I had at wide receiver is, how quickly, if at all, do you think Marvin Mims is going to push KJ Hamler for playtime or even steal playtime? Quickly.
I do. I love KJ Hamler. I mean, I don't know if you know his story a little bit, but he had a tough time, not last year, but the year before. He had a major injury, like knee, hip. It was bigger than we knew at the time. We learned actually later in the offseason or in last year in training camp that it had been rough, and he went through a lot of depression, and he kind of had to really seek out some help, and he talked a lot about that last year in training camp, and it was great. It was great that he opened up, and I think it started a lot of conversations, not just with the Broncos, but among athletes in the NFL, and so he's a great guy. I just love his story, and I love the way he kind of attacked that whole thing that he dealt with. He went head on and said, I'm gonna do this right, and I'm gonna help myself and whatever. But he's fragile. He had hamstring injuries bothering him all last year. He's had, I think, some other problems still with his knee. So I just don't think he's got the stability to maintain a long NFL career, unfortunately. So I think Marvin Mims will push that spot right away.
Okay. That's what I was hoping to hear, because I just drafted him in Dynasty the other day. So now let's take a look at some of the Vegas totals here. So at over under 8.5, you think that's high? You think that's low? You think 9 wins is a fair expectation for this team, or you think even 10, 11 makes sense, or you think it's all too optimistic?
No, I think it's actually a very fair prediction, maybe even a little optimistic. When it's funny, like when we get Sean Payton and we know we have all these weapons, and it's like you think as a Broncos fan, all right, this is the year we go to the playoffs. Well, to go to the playoffs, you pretty much figure 10, 11 wins, right? I mean,
Yeah.
now with the 17-game schedule, probably 11 at least, maybe 12, depending on your division. So when you go back and look at our schedule and you try to look at the games, it's kind of hard, honestly, to pick 11, 12 games that you're pretty sure we can win.
Yeah.
So I am hopeful we can win 9 and finally have a winning season. But I think that's going to mean we win a few games you wouldn't have expected. We don't lose some games. I mean, we lose some, but we don't lose as many as we could actually. We get away with a few, is what I'm getting at.
So I'm gonna put my optimist hat on and run through this schedule. So Raiders, that's a win.
I like
Washington,
that.
that's a win. Miami
In
September
September,
in Miami. Yeah, that's a loss.
it is a
In
lot.
Chicago,
That was tough.
I'm not sure I can go against my guys. I probably should. I'll give them it because I think that's the logical answer. I'm going to give it to the Broncos, but
Yeah.
there's just a lot of questions on the Bears like that can flip it for me.
Right.
The Jets at Mile High, I'll give them that one. I think the Jets have a lot of changes coming in, and they're coming into Mile High in October. I don't think that's easy.
Right. Early October, I think you're right.
Kansas City, I gotta. So me and my co-host, we're both Texas Tech grads. We are big Pat Mahomes guys.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I gotta give that to Mahomes.
And is that
Green
that
Bay?
one, is that one in Kansas City or is that one in Denver? The first one.
That one is Thursday night in Kansas City.
Yeah.
And fun fact for you: Thursday night home teams cover the spread at like 65%.
Yeah.
So
here's another fun fact. The last time the Broncos beat the Chiefs at Arrowhead was the Thursday night game of the Super Bowl winning season.
really,
Yeah. Which was, I mean, you may not be familiar with this game, but we call it the scoop and score game because it was the game that the running back fumbled and Bradley Roby scooped it up and ran it in for a touchdown with seconds left, and we ended up winning. We were losing, so it was a big deal. But that's the last time we beat them was a Thursday night.
okay. So it's staying in KC for that one. Next one, Green Bay at home. I'll give them that. So we're at 5
I think we
already.
win that one. Yep.
KC in Denver. I give it to Pat. I'm sorry, the ketchup man is going to take that. And then coming off the bye, this one's really interesting to me. Monday Night Football in Buffalo off the bye.
No way.
I'm going the home team, but it's Sean Payton off a bye as a dog is really interesting because he's going to be a dog in this game unless Josh Allen's hurt.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go Bills there. Minnesota, they were the biggest frauds in the NFL last year. We're not.
Nice.
We're not even playing with that one, so we're giving them 6. Cleveland, that's a real toss up to me.
Yeah. Depends a lot on how how they're playing.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that one. Actually. At Houston, I'll give them.
Yeah.
So that's 7. At Chargers, I'm gonna say they split with the Chargers, so I'm gonna give this one the Chargers. At
Detroit's getting better, as you guys know.
I'm giving Detroit this one. I think just because it's in Detroit.
With my cohorts, we gave when we did this at the beginning, right when the schedule came out, we did a little podcast, and I think we all picked Detroit on that one.
And then I'll give them New England and the next Chargers. They split with the Chargers, so that gets us to 9 right there. And then they're going to beat the Raiders again, so that's 10. I don't even have to give them the Cleveland game. And we've got 10 wins.
All right.
I think Broncos for the playoffs is one of my favorite bets this year.
Yeah. So I am optimistic for the playoffs, but I feel like it's kind of my orange Kool-Aid drinking the Kool-Aid to be that optimistic. But I'll tell you, I'm a little worried about that first game against the Raiders, and I shouldn't be, but it's the first game and there's so much riding on it. It's at home. There's going to be a lot of pressure. Everyone's going to be looking to see if Russell Wilson's better, if Sean Payton knows what he's doing with us,
Yeah.
And those games are sometimes the ones where I feel like we fall flat, the big hype. So I don't know. I'm kind of worried about it, even though maybe I shouldn't be worried about the Raiders.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some merit to, and I'd have to go back and look at what McDaniels did his first games in previous seasons, but I think there's definitely some merit to being a little worried about a offensive schemer who's had all off season to plan how he's going to do this week one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can understand being a little worried about that, but yeah, outside of that, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to touch division here, paying 5-1 or AFC champs at what is that, 25-1 and Super Bowl at 40-1. But to make the playoffs, I like it. I think I like that one a lot. And I mean, if you wanted to sprinkle AFC champs here, I could understand it at 25-1. I mean, why not? But
maybe. But that one is, I feel like I think it's still KC for another year at least.
Yeah.
My hope is that we're second, because by being second, that would solidify us as being on a good trajectory, because Chargers are good. They just always have bad luck, to be honest, and kind of a little quirky with their coach.
Chargers gonna Charger.
Right. But Herbert is a good quarterback and he's still young. And I feel like, in fact, honestly, I feel about him a little bit the way I always felt about Phillip Rivers. Like, Rivers was crazy and he could, sometimes you thought like he's just going to blow up, but other times, man, he could move that ball down the field really fast. And I always worry about Herbert. Like, he is good, and we got to play well to beat them all the way to the end of the game. So I'm always, a little.
He'll always make it tight. Make it hard.
And division rivals, you know how that is. Like, everyone plays better or plays closer, even when you're not really, as well matched as you should be. But I think KC is still just too dominant, and now Patrick Mahomes has gone through everything and still done well. So
he's just. I hope people realize what we're watching with it. Like, it's not even as just like a biased fan who, watched him in college, but like rolling through his stats, it's miraculous what he did last year.
Yes.
After shipping out their best receiver, and he just kept chugging along. And then, high ankle sprain, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'll just keep doing it. But I think that's all we got for the Broncos. We appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell everybody again one more time where they can find you and your work?
Okay, well, you can find my work, my writing, at milehighreport.com, and you can find me on Twitter at DocLLV. And I should have said earlier, I also do a YouTube show called The Roundup, and you can find that on MHR Live on YouTube.
And for anyone watching on YouTube, we will make sure to have a little icon pop up in the corner here for you.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to be here.